Okay. This guy, we've been talking because Derek asked us to talk about Ecclesiastes, but on Sunday night at the men's group we didn't do what I was planning because the discussion came up. What is this non-dual thinking that had come up last week in Ecclesiastes? So Sunday night we ended up talking about it in the men's group, and I thought, you know what? It was a great discussion. We had a great discussion, but it wasn't very organized, right? Because it was just spur of the moment, and I thought the subject deserves a more organized presentation for us to think about what is dualistic thinking and non-dualistic thinking.
Being too self-critical.
Okay. Well, even so, here we go. So, what is non-dual thinking and what is dualistic thinking? If your thought is, well, which one should I do? You're thinking dualistically, ironically, right? It's not an either or. So what is non-dual thinking? Well, we need both. There's a time for the dualistic thoughts, and then there's a time for non-dualistic thinking. It moves us beyond a kind of black and white, either or way of looking at things. And instead of either or, it's both and. Instead of black and white, it's kind of shades of gray. And those sorts of things. So that's what we're talking about. Dualistic thinking is necessary, but we want to grow into non-dualistic thinking. It's very easy for us to start off dualistically. Anyone raise teenagers? I remember when my kids either loved or hated their teachers. There was no middle ground in high school. Either that was the most vile teacher, person to ever walk the earth, or that's a great teacher. There was there's no a good teacher, but not my favorite. No, it was all or nothing. And so we kind of easily and naturally can be all or nothing thinkers. Growing into a non-dualistic, more nuanced way of thinking takes some maturity, some growth. And so that's what we're talking about. So what is dualistic? A dualistic mindset? Well, it's black and white, either or. All or nothing is the way 12-step groups talk about it. All or nothing. Or even good or bad. Now, the last one can kind of bother us sometimes. It's like, well, is that undercutting all of morality? No. But we start to realize, well, as I go on, you'll understand. There's some truth to black and white, either or, even all or nothing thinking, and good and bad thinking. But it's not the whole story. And that's kind of what we want to get to is what's the whole story. On the good and bad, it used to annoy me when I was in Africa, working with these very young believers. They would ask questions like, well, is this a sin? And I'm like, okay, so let me throw it out. Is lying a sin? Well, generally, unless the Gestapo are looking for Jews and you're hiding them, then lie, right? Because we kind of know, while generally deceiving someone else, especially for my own benefit or to humiliate them or get one over on them, that's not good. But there's some times when you don't need to tell the truth and maybe flat out even lie. I've told you before, if you ask me about someone and I know something in confidence, I'm going to lie to you. Are they doing okay? Sure. But I happen to know they're having a struggle, right? But I can't tell you that. I can't even let on that I know something. Am I technically lying to you? Yes. But that's the only way to keep a confidence. If someone asks a question innocently, I gotta lie, right?
Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, go ahead.
My father-in-law, towards the end of his life, had dementia. The people of Harpeth Hills were really great. They had a phrase, they called it therapeutic lying. And they were serious, and it was the truth. Like every day, John would look for Linda. He would forget she was gone and relive that, and it was awful. And kindness and love was a higher value than technical truthfulness. And so the loving thing to do was to lie. It just was.
Right.
Because the truth was awful.
Right. Because then he had to relive her loss every day. But if you say, oh no, she'll be back later, then he doesn't relive her loss. Are you lying? Yes. But he needs that, right? It's a great example, right? So even when we say good or bad, it's not that there aren't things that are generally good and bad, but we realize sometimes it's both and, right? So that's kind of where we're headed. Okay, so this is the world from a dualistic mindset. So I've taken those same things, black and white, either or, all or nothing, bad and good. And the dualistic mindset says the world is split into these two spheres. And everything either falls on one side or the other. Is that kind of making sense? Once again, there are certain ways in which this is useful and necessary. You're not going to dispense with this kind of thinking in total. The thing is to realize that there's more than simply this division into two sides, either or, and to learn to distinguish. Now, this helps us learn, in fact, to distinguish, right? That kind of dualistic thinking helps us distinguish things. But here's what I would suggest is the true shape of reality. See, the two poles are still there, but now there's a connecting line, a continuum between them. Are there black and white? Yes, you can talk about black and white, either or, as the extremes, but reality is not just two categories. Reality is all the messiness in between the two extremes. Because none of us really live at the extremes. We're somewhere in the middle. Making sense? Okay, so far. See, so far it's a more straightforward, organized presentation, right? Now, here's the thing is, so when we read like a parable of Jesus about the sheep and the goats and the goats are the polar ends. But are you a sheep or a goat? Yeah. Yes, right? Because the reality is in the messiness of the middle, sometimes I do something for the least of these and sometimes I don't, which is his category, right? Sometimes I care about the person who's hungry and sometimes I don't. So am I a sheep or a goat? It's not either or, it's I'm both. The same thing with the parable of the four soils. I mean, I kind of grew up where you had to figure out which soil you were, rather than the reality being you're kind of all those soils at the same time. On certain subjects, I'm just hard of hearing. It never sinks in. On other subjects, I might be very receptive. On other things, certain anxieties or concerns, interrupt and take things away from me. So you look at that parable, it's got four soils, but we're all somewhere in the middle, a kind of amalgamation of all of them. So that's some of what we're trying to recognize. So instead of the black or white, we've got shades of gray. Instead of either or, it's both and. Instead of all or nothing, the AA phrase is it's about progress, not perfection. AA says the problem is you're all or nothing thinking. Like, I got to be totally sober for the rest of my life. And of course they say, take it one day at a time, stop thinking so long. But it's about progress, not perfection. If you get fixated on I've got to be perfect, like I've got to perfectly overcome my addictive tendencies, you'll be defeated in the face of the task. And so the emphasis is it's just about making progress. So against all or nothing thinking, AA talks about progress, not perfection, right? Which is you're somewhere in the middle on the journey from one place to the other. And of course, the last one, good and bad, well, everything is holy and yet corruptible. That's how I would state it. Right? Everything God has made is holy and good, and yet everything can be corrupted. And that's the part when someone says, "Well, is this good?" Well, as God made it, how are you using it? Well, maybe you're not using the good thing of God in a good way, and therefore you're corrupting it.
And everything can be redeemed.
Right, and everything can be redeemed. Yeah, so it's all holy, it all can be corrupted, but it all can also be redeemed, which is the middle ground between, is it simply good or bad? Right? That making sense? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Jesus, dualism, and non-dualism. I've given some examples. Can you think of some other examples where Jesus is very first dualistic?
Yeah, the poor you'll have with you always.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of a blanket dualistic statement. The poor, right? You'll have them with you always.
When he healed on the Sabbath, and even though they say, keep the Sabbath holy, there were occasions where he, worked on it.
Yeah, which might be where he's actually being a little non-dualistic. Because he
Going against.
yeah, because he realizes Sabbath is not just an all or nothing deal, right? So it's a great example, but it's where he's non-dualistic. It's like, does he keep the Sabbath holy? Yeah. But does he do some things that make some people uncomfortable? Yeah. Right? But where is he very dualistic?
Sometimes he told people, don't go tell about this miracle. And then sometimes he said, do go.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah, where he's very, and then we see the oddness of he does one thing or another. What about like in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you cannot serve God and mammon? That's dualistic. God's on one pole, mammon's on the other. You can't do both. It's one or the other. Now, realistically, what do? Well, a little of both, right? Because none of us perfectly serve God, and none of us are perfectly given over to serving the god of mammon, which was actually a god representing wealth and things like that. But so he presents it dualistically. So I mentioned the parable of the sheep and the goats. Dualistic. They're sheep and goats.
You must be born again. You cannot see the kingdom of God.
Yes, okay, that's a very dualistic statement. It's all or nothing. You must be born again or you cannot see the kingdom. Right? Yeah. And so Jesus will make these statements. What about at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the wise and foolish builders? The wise man built his house on the rock. The foolish man built it on the sand. Either or, one or the other. Who are you, wise or foolish? And the reality is, well, somewhere in the middle again. Sometimes building well, sometimes building poorly. So Jesus will talk about the dualism to emphasize a truth. But the reality, I would say, is here in this middle part where it's not in our lives all or nothing. It doesn't come out that way.
I think of another great diagram that you introduced, which is the arrows pointing towards God or moving sideways or whatever.
Right.
I wonder here if it might be that same thing, have reality with an arrow either way, because you're saying in the middle. And really, the reality is sometimes you're very close to black.
Sure.
And sometimes you're very close
To white. Yeah. You're somewhere on that blue line, right? Yeah, you're right. It's and I fluctuate, right? I'm not always in the same spot.
minute to minute.
Yeah. But what about another dualistic statement of Jesus? There's a broad way leading to destruction, and there's a narrow way leading to life, and few there be that find it. That's a dualistic statement, right? Broad and narrow. Which one are you on? So he uses those kinds of statements to challenge the thinking of the people he's talking to.
Isn't that sort of what the Ten Commandments is about?
Well, sure. They're very clear-cut, black and white kind of statements. Yeah, the Ten Commandments. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of things. Now, I want us to look at a couple places where Jesus is very non-dualistic. We've already started some, but here's one that is extremely non-dualistic. So here's the statement from Luke 9:50. But Jesus said to him, do not stop him, for whoever is not against you is for you. And then he says later, whoever is not with me is against me. Do you realize how at odds those two statements are? Right? Whoever is not against you is for you, but whoever is not against me, whoever is not with me is against me. Which is it, Jesus? Make sense, please. You're saying the opposite, right? Well, the only way to make sense of it is to realize we have to look at it in a non-dualistic way, in a both-and kind of way, because it sounds like it's got to be either or. Because each statement is very either or, but taken together, now it's this paradox. Is it true that if whoever is not against you is for you? Well, in some respects, that's a true statement. And is it true that whoever is not with me is against me? Well, yes, that's also true, right? They're two true statements, and they kind of point to the middle where they meet in a paradox.
You said the Ten Commandments that, it's like the law was more dualism.
Sure.
So we're moving from the law.
Yeah, if we take the history of Israel as a story of personal spiritual growth, like we're all Israel, we come out of slavery out of Egypt, and the first thing you get are some clear black and whites. But then come along the prophets, and they start challenging all of that. Like Moses may be more black and white, but the prophets aren't. Isaiah's not. Hosea's not. These guys start saying things that challenge a black and white reading of the law. So I think it shows us a kind of a pattern of growth. We have to do the same thing. We have to start with some foundational dualism, but then maturity means you realize, while true, it is not ultimately true. While helpful, it's not ultimately the case. Well, what about Jesus' this statement? I and the Father are one. Wait, you just identified two, and you said you're one. You've got I, and you've got the Father, and yet you're saying we're one?
Oh, it gets worse.
Oh, yeah. Right? Yeah. But that's the problem. I remember growing up listening to people trying to, what is that one? They have one purpose. They have one love, because they didn't know how to understand it. They're always searching for what's the nature of the oneness, because there's clearly a two-ness, right? Well, and like Bob alludes, you can't be at peace with the idea of the Trinity from a dualistic mind, right? Because you instantly think, how can there be three and yet one? Dualistically, it's one or the other. There's either three or there's one. And I don't know how to combine three and one. So the very core, the core understandings of our Christian faith are non-dualistic. The Trinity, the Incarnation. Jesus is fully God and fully human. I don't get that, right? It's got to be one or the other. If he's a man, a human being, then he can't also be God. And if he's God, well, then he can't really be a human being, right? So you take the Trinity, the incarnation of God in the flesh, these core fundamental aspects of our Christian faith are challenging because they're non-dual in nature.
So glad you don't wrap this up.
Yeah, see. Which is why it's okay to say, I cannot wrap my mind around that. You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to say, I get it. You're supposed to say, a mystery of reality that I cannot fully grasp. I can understand there's something of communal love in the nature of God, who is Father, Son, and Spirit, in this ontological, this reality of oneness. But I can't understand that.
And that's okay.
Yeah, and that's okay. But I can also lean into it and say, but I do understand that this is pointing me towards a kind of harmony and unity and one anotherness that then is supposed to be replicated in my life and in our lives together. That somehow the mystery of the Trinity, while I can't understand it, it does make clear some things about love and community. And that I want to try and lean into in the mystery of Father, Son, and Spirit. And the same with the nature of Christ as both God and man, right? Because we embody the same mystery. We were created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and yet we're definitely very much finite humans. Well, how do you put those two together? You have something of the divine, and yet you are clearly human. So, you can either reject one and take the other, or vice versa. Or in a non-dual way, you can say that my own existence is a mystery of God's work and grace. And somehow I do have a kind of created natural affinity for God, a capacity to be with God. Now, I don't know how to do that. I'm a complete wreck at doing it. But it's not that it can't be done. God has made me this way, and he's drawing me up into himself, into his communion. So at the heart, we're talking about, non-dual thinking. Thoughts, questions, completely glassed over in your right now? Yeah.
We're talking about the Ten Commandments. I was just thinking of this as a possible example, where it says that if you're caught in adultery, you should be stoned, and then Jesus says, "Sure, you without sin cast the first stone."
Yes.
So how do you live that out?
Right. Yeah, you've got Moses' law definitely, labeling this is wrong and the punishment of this is death. And then here's Jesus, when confronted with that very situation, he doesn't do that. Right? And then he encourages people to do some self-introspection before they decide what's up with that? Well, is he denying that this sexual infidelity is not helpful to the woman or whoever else she's with? No, he's not denying that. But at the same time, it's not an all or nothing thinking like it was kind of presented in the law, right? He understands, well, it's more complicated. And there's room for mercy here, right?
I think there's something in human nature that wants dualism.
Yes.
And I think, that's part of what has created so much division in religion.
Right.
It's because we don't want to lean into the non-dualism. We want black and white answers.
And I'll give you a little something that I learned in counseling as well, is that the more anxious we get, the more we want things dualistic. Our world right now is very anxious, and guess what? We're very dualistic. And if we'd all calm down, we could listen to the other person and go, well, maybe they got a point, right? But when you're highly anxious, they don't have a point at all. We just need to get rid of them, right?
Well, with dualism, you can assume that there is a right answer that you can achieve.
Yeah, absolute right and wrong, good and bad.
Yeah.
So, it's a phenomenon of when we get anxious as human beings, we start going, we revert in terms of our maturity. A person could be at a mature place where they can understand, well, everyone's got a point of view, but if they get highly anxious, they're likely to do a retrograde thing and go back to, well, look, I'm right, they're wrong, it's us versus them. But in a calm moment, they would realize, well, it's not quite that way. It's a little more simple. So when we've got a highly anxious atmosphere, it's encouraging everyone to be to draw lines, right? So we're like the leaven against all of that, going, no, I'm not going to do that. Not going to be highly anxious. Not going to draw lines. Not going to fall into dualism. Yeah, Bob.
Well, I always worry about a good degree of moral relativism, where people tend to conjure up what seems to fit best with the way they feel about something, which could be many ways. And depending upon how they were brought up, depending upon what country they live in. I mean, you can think about things in a lot of different ways. I mean, if you just look at the world, I mean, we have wars in various places, you know, and we all take sides to some degree in those, other than saying it'd be nice not to have them. But, you know, you have people that struggle for territory, people that struggle for security, and you can always make it relativistic and satisfying that way. So I always worry not so much that things are dualistic at times, because that can take a good deal less thought. But when things are relativistic, now we're talking about some nuances with it where people will ultimately always disagree. And I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Because you could always divide things that way into the all or none, the either or, and come to some degree of answer. Relativism doesn't permit that. So you're going to wind up in some very terrible places that way. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. No, you've got a great point, because sometimes a non-dual way of thinking can be viewed as its complete subjective relativism. Like, I have my truth, you have your truth, we'll all just get along while we're all making up reality as we want it to be. Yeah, I don't think that's healthy, because there is something with which we are engaging a reality, not just as I want it to be, but as it is. Go to AA again, it says, accept life on life's terms. There is something I have to accept. So what makes this not just kind of a rampant relativism? After our discussion Sunday night, one person was texting me some questions, and they were good questions. I agreed with all of them, and the person was like, phew. Because the point was, in non-dualistic thinking, can you not say anything then? Like, this is something? Well, Jesus just said, I and the Father are one. That is somewhere he identifies as a place to stand. He's not saying, well, I and the Father are one if that's what you like it to be. It's not a relativistic thing. He's saying, I and the Father are one. When he says you should love your neighbors yourself, he's not making that a movable thing that you can take or not take. He says that's it. So it's not kind of a personal relativism, like I get to make it whatever I want, but it is the understanding that when I make a statement like love your neighbor as yourself, when we get down into the bits of that, it gets very, very complex and sometimes even contradictory on the surface. Like, what you do to love one neighbor might be the exact opposite of what you do to love another neighbor. Like, it's not reduced to, well, then just do this. Because love, as we know, can have many appropriate forms. So we all talk about, maybe in too much of a popular sense and not with enough understanding, but we talk about tough love. Sometimes we label things tough love and it's just being mean, right? Not everything called tough love is really the idea of tough love. It's kind of like it's an excuse to just, stick it to them. But there is a true concept of when the most loving thing to do is to not aid someone in a situation. Again, AA says when they're about to fall down, you don't have to put a pillow under their butt. Let them land. Be a little jarring, but they might need that. But often the enabler is always there like, oh, let me make it better for you. Let me make it better for you. And it's like, no. So the loving thing is not to help them when something's going wrong, so that they have to figure out, I might have a problem. But in a very similar situation, something goes wrong for someone, and you immediately step in to help, right? So you're doing the opposite thing. It's not an either or. Well, do you help them or do you not? Tell me the context. Tell me the situation. Help me understand what's going on. And then we'll know what does love look like. So it's not just to make the point, it's not to say there's not like these things that guide us, these statements that we adhere to. We just realize to do that sometimes can look very different, and that's where it gets challenging. Alan?
When you said tough love means being mean, some people can be being mean. I think about teenagers and think, yeah, that's probably pretty good adjective. I am being mean. But we were having in Lectio this week or last week, we talked about the eye of the needle. And Jesus is quoted in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the American dualism, non-dualism issue of the eye of the needle for a rich man. And I think we're all affluent here on the world standards.
Right.
You know, I'm all for non-dualism on Jesus' statement there. So
Yes, lest it indict me.
yes. So explain that to us, preacher.
What? What, the eye of the needle?
A poor man or a rich man can't get that.
Yeah.
It's easier for a rich man to get to heaven than to go through, camel through an eye of the needle.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
I don't think a camel can go through the eye of the needle.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's various, I won't explore all the ways people work with that. So, and his disciples' reaction to that statement is, well, then who can be saved? And his response is, with man, it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. What's he encouraging? To me, he's encouraging, I think this is how Jesus often will teach. He brings up the dualism. Well, are rich people favored by God and therefore guaranteed they must be going into the kingdom? Or are rich people barred from going into the kingdom? Now what was their default? How rich people are favored by God. I mean, that's why they're rich. It's like Job. I'm rich because God loves me better than he loves that poor person. Wonder who sinned, right? That he lives in such squalor, right? What sin is he being, chastised for? So they're in the dualistic thing of rich people are definitely favored. Jesus throws up the opposite extreme. Rich people just have no chance. And then they're like, and then he points out, but what if we're talking about something else entirely? God can work the impossible. So that would be kind of my shorthand would be, I think he's playing into their dualism, but then he's subverting it and saying, you got to think beyond that because God can actually do what you think is impossible. Right? Now, how does he work all that out? Well, there's a lot to that. But obviously he does it. I say obviously. Some people tell me, I keep saying obviously too much, and it may be obvious to me, but it's not to others. so it's probably a bad habit. It seems to me apparent that he has lots of rich people hanging around with him who are his disciples, like Nicodemus, like Joseph of Arimathea. These are rich people, and some women who bankrolled his ministry. And he didn't tell them to sell everything they have, nor obviously turn them away from the kingdom because of their wealth. So then we have to go back to what's he getting to? I think he's playing off the dualism. He's challenging the assumptions, and then he's trying to paint a different way. All right. Let's do quickly another little. Let's look at Paul and dualism versus non-dualism in Paul. Okay, here's a couple dualistic statements by Paul. And again, dualism is not always like inappropriate or something. There's times when you need to say something like this. Paul says, whatever is not of faith is sin. Right? Romans 14, 23 or something. Whatever is not of faith is sin. You got two categories, Paul. You got things of faith, and then everything else is sin. It's dualistic in its presentation, and it's true. Now, there's more to the story than that, right? But he makes that kind of statement. Another one that Paul will talk about, like in Romans, he'll say, you're either slaves to sin or you're slaves to God. You're gonna be a slave to someone. It's either sin or Christ or God. Either or. Right? But then, Paul can also be very... Oh, and here's another one. Works of the flesh versus fruit of the Spirit. I mean, he's always contrasting flesh with spirit. And a lot of people kind of get caught up on that. Is these flesh mean our bodies? Like, it's bad to be in a body? Like, the body's the problem? But he's always talking about walking in the Spirit versus gratifying the flesh. So that's a dualistic paradigm he uses. But we need to understand he also says things that are beyond that, right? So there's a way in which the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit are part of the same line. Okay, it sounds like they're dismissing, so we're going to finish. I'm actually going to get through all these slides. So last one. So here's where I think he's doing something like that, okay? Here's a statement by Paul that's non-dualistic. To the pure, all things are pure, but to the corrupt and unbelieving, nothing is pure. Now, it's a pair of dualistic statements. To the pure, all things are pure, but to the unbelieving, to the corrupt, nothing is pure. In fact, their very minds and consciences are corrupted.
That sounds dualistic.
It is dualistic, but then that's the... Right, so he can be this very, very dualistic, but at the same time, it's non-dualistic, because when he says, to the pure, all things are pure, what happened to your list of good things and bad things? In other words, if you say, but these are definitely bad things, he just said, well, to the pure, all things are pure. And you're like, oh, does that mean murder is pure? Right? Of course, he doesn't mean that. But in one way, this is a very non-dualistic statement, because it'd be easy to think, well, what happened to theft and these grievous sins? He just said to the pure, all things are pure. So like, if I have a good, pure heart, I can do anything? I actually had someone ask me that one time. They wanted to do something that was, I don't think, morally good, but they were thinking, well, to the pure, all things are pure, right? I'm like, I don't know that that's what he means, right? I don't think that's what he's getting at. Like, this is an excuse to be able to engage in what you want. Yeah, I think we got a problem, right? So but see, what I'm saying is, it's dualistic and yet it's non-dualistic. It's challenging. You think about what he's saying, because then he says, to the pure, all things are pure, but to the corrupt, all things are corrupt. So he's really saying how you engage it determines whether it in its reality is one or the other. It's not so much intrinsic to it, it's how you engage it. So it's that idea, everything was created good, but I can misuse anything and everything, or I can use it as it was intended for good. Okay, last one. So then here, in line with that, Paul says, all things are permissible for me, but not all things are beneficial. All things are permitted for me, but I will not be determined by anything. So it's again that same place where he's saying, I don't view the world as black and white, good things, bad things. I know in one sense it's all permissible, and yet I know in another sense maybe it's not all beneficial. So I have to sort through. I can't just simply ask, like I got asked, is it a sin? I don't know. Let's talk about what we're talking about and where you are. You can't just give a blanket ruling like that.
You gotta ask.
Yeah, if you got to ask, you're starting to wonder, well, what do you... Yeah, the good thing, well, do you think it is? Because if you think it is, it will be if you do it. Right? If you're already not sure, maybe you ought to stay away from whatever that is. Okay. Well, I don't know if that helped a lot, but...
Let me could I...
Go ahead.
This hit me a while ago when you were talking.
Right.
But, okay. Let me make a statement. You tell me if it's on target. In dualistic thinking, non-dualistic thinking is not allowed.
Right.
In non-dualistic thinking, dualistic thinking is allowed.
Yes.
It's part of that and it comes within that purview.
Right, right.
So it's okay to have some dualistic thinking.
It's necessary. Yeah, yeah. That's why Jesus will use it, like I showed Paul will use it. Yeah, it's necessary. If we don't think about things, to talk about the extremes, you do that dualistically. Right. No, you said it very well. In dualistic thinking, all non-dual thinking seems crazy. But from a non-dualistic perspective, you recognize there's a place for the dualistic and there's a place for the non-dualistic. Like both have their time and place to be helpful. That's well said. Okay, Daryl, and you get the last thought.
Okay, I was just going to say that in reality, though, our level of maturity in whatever we're talking about dictates. I mean, we start as children where we need dualism, right?
Oh, yeah.
And as we mature, which you've already talked about, then we begin in a more advanced way understanding that there's no actual dualism that exists. We've got to somehow engage that in good, better, best type of way.
Right. Yeah, the dualism is not a perfect description of reality as we find it.
And as a young Christian, I would probably be more dualistic because that's where I need to start to actually begin to do
This is true. We start dualistically. Hopefully we can grow to a more non-dual mindset. It's very challenging, right? But it is the only place we can engage the Trinity, the Incarnation, the very fundamental mysteries of Christian faith. They're drawing us out of our dualistic mind. And even these scriptures, we got to be drawn out of our dualistic mind to read them. Okay, we'll stop there.